The reading of my father-in-law's will was scheduled for a Tuesday, which struck me as a cruel day for a thing like that. Not a Monday, when you might still have the weekend's armor on. A Tuesday, when you're already tired and have no good reason for it. I sat in the corner of Mitchell Verk's office, my father-in-law's attorney, a man I'd met maybe 4 times in 30 years, and I kept my hands folded in my lap the way my mother taught me to sit in church. Still, quiet, like you belonged there, even when you weren't sure you did. My daughter-in-law Priscilla had taken the seat directly across from the desk, the power seat. She'd worn a cream blazer and had her hair done. I noticed that. You notice things like that when you're trying not to cry in front of people who would enjoy it. My son Edward sat beside her. He didn't look at me when I came in. He hadn't looked at me in 4 years. I should explain what I mean by that. Not the looking away. That part I understood by then. I mean the 4 years, and what I did, and why I did it, and why I took me until a Tuesday in Mitchell Rourke's office to feel like any of it had mattered. My name is Rosalind. I'm 63 years old. I live in a rented house in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is not where I imagined I would be at 63. I imagined I'd be in the farmhouse outside Natchitoches, where my husband George and I raised Edward, where his father Earl had raised him, where there were pecans in the yard, and a porch that faced west so you got the last of the light in the evening. That was the plan. Grow old there, die there, eventually. Watch grandchildren run through the same rooms. George died 11 years ago. Heart attack. Fast, no warning. The way some people are lucky enough to go. I say lucky because I watched what came after. What a slow death looks like, and I would not have wished it on him. After George died, Earl was alone. He was 79 then, and sharp as a tack mentally, but his body had started to betray him the way bodies do. His hip was bad. His eyesight was going. He'd lived alone in that farmhouse his whole adult life except for the years George's mother was alive. And he was proud. Lord, that man was proud. And he didn't ask for help. But I could see it. I could see the dishes in the sink when I came by on Sundays. The way he moved from room to room with his hand on the wall. Edward saw it too. He just didn't stay. By then, Edward and Priscilla had moved to Houston. Good jobs, nice neighborhood, the life they'd built together. I don't begrudge them that. You don't stay in Natchitoches if you have options, necessarily. But Earl was getting older, and someone needed to be nearby, and I was the one who was there. I made a choice. I want to be clear that it was a choice. Nobody forced me. Earl certainly never asked. He would have rather fallen down a flight of stairs alone than admitted he needed his daughter-in-law around. But I started coming by every day instead of once a week. Then I started coming by twice a day. Then I gave up my apartment in town and moved into the back bedroom. That was 7 years ago. 7 years before that Tuesday in Mitchell's office. Edward didn't ask me to do it. He didn't thank me for doing it. What he did, 6 months after I moved in, was call me on a Sunday evening and tell me, in a voice that had clearly been rehearsed, that Priscilla felt it was important that they be the primary decision-makers for Earl's care, that if there were ever any major medical or financial decisions to be made, they should be consulted first, that they would be flying in quarterly to check on things. Quarterly, I said, of course, because what else do you say to your only child? What I didn't say was that quarterly visits don't cover the 2 a.m. falls. They don't cover the 3-hour round trip to the specialist in Shreveport every 6 weeks. They don't cover the nights Earl got confused. It happened more and more in that last year, and called me by his dead wife's name. And I sat on the edge of his bed and held his hand and answered to a name that wasn't mine because it was what he needed. Priscilla came during those quarterly visits and rearranged the kitchen. She bought Earl a new recliner he didn't want. She called the home health aide I'd already hired and interviewed her as if this were all new information. And she looked at me. She had a particular way of looking at me, chin slightly lifted, like she was trying to remember who I was and why I was in the room. It was at Christmas, 2 years before Earl died, that she said it out loud for the first time. We were in the kitchen. Edward had taken Earl into the living room to watch football, and Priscilla and I were washing up. It should have been fine. We'd managed fine for years, a kind of cold civility that worked as long as nobody pressed on it. She said without looking up from the dishes, "You know he's going to leave everything to Edward. You understand that, right? The house, whatever he has in savings, all of it." I said I knew that. "I just want to make sure you're not—" She paused, searching for the word, expecting something. "For your time here." I set down the dish I was drying. I turned and looked at her and I said, very evenly, "I'm not expecting anything." She nodded, like that settled something. Like I had confirmed a suspicion she'd already filed away. I went back to drying the dish and I did not say what I was thinking, which was that I had not moved into that house for something. I'd moved in because Earl was my family, the last of the family George and I had built together, and because no one else was going to, and because the thought of him falling in the bathroom and lying there until a quarterly visit was something I could not live with. I don't think she ever understood that. I'm not sure she believed it was possible. Earl died on a Thursday in March. I was with him. His breathing had changed in the night. That specific change that the hospice nurse had described to me. And I sat in the chair beside his bed, and I held his hand, and I read to him from a book of Louisiana history that he'd loved his whole life, and sometime around 4 in the morning he was gone. I called Edward. Then I called the hospice nurse. Then I sat in the kitchen and made a pot of coffee and watched the sun come up over the pecan trees, and I tried to figure out how to grieve a man who wasn't mine to grieve. Not officially, anyway. He was my father-in-law, not my father. My husband had been dead for 4 years by then. I was not blood. I was not in the will. I was, as Priscilla had made clear in various small ways over 7 years, essentially a very dedicated caretaker who had chosen to work for free. Edward and Priscilla flew in the next day. Priscilla walked through the house in that way she had, touching things, taking inventory. Edward dealt with the funeral arrangements. They were efficient about it. They were good at efficient. The funeral was on a Monday. Neighbors came, people from Earl's church, a few old friends who had survived long enough to see him out. It was a good service. I sat in the second row, which felt about right. Not family, not stranger. Afterward, at the house, Priscilla found me in the kitchen again. She had a glass of sweet tea and an expression I recognized. The settled one. The one that meant something had been decided. "Mitchell Rohr is coming Tuesday," she said, "to read the will. You're welcome to be there, of course." That, of course, did a lot of work. It meant you don't have to be, and we won't mind if you're not. It'll mostly just be formalities, you understand. I said I understood. I did understand. I just didn't know yet what I understood. Tuesday came. I drove myself to Mitchell Rourke's office in town and arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting room with a magazine I didn't read. Edward and Priscilla arrived together. She had the cream blazer on. He held the door for her. He looked surprised to see me, not displeased, just surprised, like he'd forgotten I'd been invited. We filed into the office. Mitchell was a tall man, white-haired, with the kind of unhurried manner that either means someone is very wise or very well paid. Probably both with Earl. He asked if we wanted water. Nobody wanted water. He set a leather portfolio on the desk and opened it. I folded my hands in my lap. Priscilla was watching Mitchell the way you watch a door you're expecting to open. He read the preliminary language, the declarations, the sound mind, the revocation of prior wills, the standard architecture of a document designed to determine what happens to a life after the life is over. I had heard this kind of language before, when George died, though George hadn't had much to leave. Then Mitchell turned to Edward. "To my son, Edward George Calloway, I leave the sum of $1. The room went very still. I don't think I breathed. I watched Priscilla's face. I couldn't help it. And I saw it happen. The shift. Like something had disconnected behind her eyes. Edward made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Mitchell did not look up from the document. He had the practiced neutrality of a man who had read wills for 40 years and seen every possible reaction. He continued, "The $1 is not an oversight. I am aware of my son's financial situation. I am aware of his wife's opinion of my wishes. This amount is deliberate, and it reflects my belief that my son has already received, through his mother's inheritance in 2019, more than an equitable share of what this family has built, the 2019 inheritance." I had forgotten about that, or rather, I had not known the details. Earl had never discussed it directly, but I remembered that year, Edward and Priscilla had renovated their house in Houston, a large renovation. I'd seen the pictures. Mitchell turned the page. "To my daughter-in-law, Rosalind Ann Calloway, I leave the farmhouse at 4418 Parish Road, 117, Natchitoches, Louisiana, its contents and all remaining liquid assets, currently valued at approximately $2.3 million. I heard Priscilla pull in a breath. I stared at the desk. $2.3 million. And the farmhouse. The house with the pecan trees. The porch that faced west. Mitchell set the document down and looked over his reading glasses at all of us, the way a teacher looks at a classroom after delivering an assignment. "There is a letter," he said, "attached to the will. Earl asked that it be read aloud, if that's agreeable." Nobody said it wasn't. He picked up a separate, smaller envelope. He'd already opened it, clearly prepared. He cleared his throat. "Rosalind," he read, "if you're hearing this, then I was too much of an old fool to say it to your face while I had the chance, so I'm making Mitchell do it for me, which is cowardly and also cheaper than therapy, and I think you'll forgive me for both." I made a noise I hadn't expected to make, something between a laugh and a sob. I pressed my hand over my mouth. Mitchell continued, "You came to this house because George asked you to look after me before he died. You didn't tell anyone that. I figured it out myself. From the way you arrived, the timing of it, that was like him. To ask the one person he knew would actually do it, and to ask quietly, so she couldn't say no. You were a good wife to my son. You have been a better daughter to me than I deserved. The meals and the doctor's appointments I can count. What I cannot count is the number of times you sat with me at night when I was scared and didn't know how to say so. You never made me say so, you just stayed. I was crying by then. Not loudly. I was raised to cry quietly. I know you never expected anything for it. That's why I'm leaving you everything, not as payment. Payment would be insulting, and anyway, it wouldn't be enough. I'm leaving it to you because it's right, and because this house has known your footsteps for 7 years, and it knows them better than it knows anyone else's anymore else. Take care of the pecans. They're particular." Mitchell set the letter down. The room was very quiet. Priscilla spoke first. Her voice was careful, modulated, the voice of a woman who had learned to argue without appearing to argue. "I think we should discuss whether this reflects Earl's state of mind in his final months. Given his confusion, Earl Calloway executed this will 14 months ago," Mitchell said, without changing his expression. "In my office, with 2 witnesses, he was examined by his physician, Dr. Betrayal. Renata O.C. of Natchitoches Regional, 1 week prior, who assessed him as having full testamentary capacity. I have that documentation." He had it, clearly, because he opened a second folder and set it on the desk with the quiet efficiency of a man who had anticipated this conversation. Priscilla looked at Edward. Edward was looking at the floor. "Edward," I said. He looked up. His face was doing something complicated. Not anger, not grief exactly. Something in between. Like a man who had been told something he already knew and had been hoping not to have confirmed. I said, Your grandfather loved you. That hasn't changed." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once, very slightly, and looked away again. We didn't speak again in that office. Priscilla gathered her things with the controlled movements of someone who was saving the actual reaction for private. Mitchell walked us out with the same unhurried manner he'd walked us in. The sky outside was a clean, flat blue, the kind of March sky that doesn't care what just happened inside. I sat in my car for a long time before I started it. The weeks that followed were not simple. Priscilla had a Houston attorney send a letter within 10 days, questioning the will. Mitchell handled it. The physician's documentation held. The witnesses held. 14 months was a long runway of intention, and Earl had built it deliberately, which, I came to understand, was entirely in character. He'd been planning this. He hadn't told me. He knew I'd have argued. Told him to leave it to Edward. Done the self-effacing thing I'd been doing for 7 years. So he'd simply not told me. He'd made his decision and put it in a drawer and let me keep living in his house and driving him to his appointments and reading to him about Louisiana history. And he'd known what he was going to do the whole time. It made me cry all over again when I realized it. Not sad crying. The other kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere lower and older than sadness. Edward called me 6 weeks after the reading. Priscilla had not called. Probably wouldn't. That was fine. He said, "I want to apologize." I sat down at the kitchen table. The kitchen table in Earl's house, my house now, though it still didn't feel like mine, and I waited. I let things go a long time without saying something I should have said. About what you did. About how much it mattered. He paused. "I think I knew, somewhere, that you were carrying more than you should have been. It was easier not to look at it directly." "I know," I said. "That doesn't make it okay." "No," I said. "It doesn't." Another pause. Longer. He said, "Dad asked me once, years ago, before he got sick, he asked me if I knew what kind of woman you were. I thought it was a strange question. I said, of course I did. You were my mother." He stopped. He said no. He meant the kind of woman who shows up. Not when it's convenient. Not when there's something in it for her. Just shows up. He said there weren't as many of them as people like to think. I looked out the window at the pecan trees. They were starting to bud. Earl had said they were particular, and he wasn't wrong. They had their own opinions about the season, always came in a little late. "He was right about you," Edward said. "I'm sorry I let you go so long without saying that. I told him I loved him. I told him to come visit when he was ready. I told him the pecans would probably come in well this year if we got enough rain, and he should bring the kids if he wanted. He said he would. I don't know yet if he meant it. That part of the story is still in progress. Some things take longer to repair than a phone call, and I've lived long enough to know that the wanting to fix something and the fixing of it are two different distances. But I sat at that kitchen table after we hung up, with the March light coming through the window, and I thought about George asking me. This was 18 years ago now. He knew he was sick. We didn't talk about it directly, but we both knew. I thought about him asking me, quietly, to keep an eye on his father. Just that. Keep an eye on him. I had done that. Not for the money. Not for the house, though I loved that house. Not because I expected anything or had arranged anything or had maneuvered my way into a dead man's good graces. I had done it because George asked me to, and because I loved Earl, and because the night he held my hand at George's funeral and didn't say anything, just held my hand and stood there, I understood that we were in it together, the two of us, and that was enough reason. The pecans were particular. Earl had been right about that too. I went out to check on them that afternoon in the long light of a late Louisiana March, and I put my hand on the bark of the oldest one the way I'd seen Earl do 1,000 times, and I said, out loud, to nobody, "Okay, I'm here." That felt like the right thing to say. I keep thinking about that pecan tree, the oldest one, the one I put my hand on after everything was settled. Earl used to say the pecans were particular, and he meant it as a mild complaint, but I think he loved them for exactly that reason. They didn't produce on anyone else's schedule. They did what they did when they were ready. I spent 7 years in that house without knowing what Earl had decided. Not because he hid it from me exactly, but because he understood something I hadn't figured out yet, that telling me would have changed why I stayed. And he didn't want that. He wanted to know for himself what kind of person I actually was when there was nothing in it for me. That's not a test most people think to run. Most people assume they know. Earl was more careful than that. What I've come to understand is that the life you build in the invisible years, the years nobody is watching, the years there's no reward coming, that's the only life that's really yours. Priscilla spent 7 years watching for what she could protect. I spent 7 years just showing up. Neither of us was performing. That's the thing. We were both being exactly who we were, and the will just made it visible. I don't think Priscilla is a bad person. I've thought about this a lot, sitting at that kitchen table with my coffee in the morning. I think she never learned to do something hard for its own sake. Not because she was lazy or cruel, but because nobody had asked her to, and she'd arranged her life carefully enough that nobody ever would. There's a kind of intelligence in that, and also a kind of poverty. You become very good at protecting what you have and very unequipped for the moments when what you have isn't enough. Edward called me and apologized, and I meant it when I said I loved him. But I also know that love and accountability aren't the same distance. He's going to have to decide what kind of man he is in the years ahead, not in one phone call. That's the work that doesn't have a finish line. Knowing the right thing and then building the daily habit of actually doing it, even when it's inconvenient, even when Priscilla's in the other room, even when it costs you something. What I want to say to anyone who's in the invisible years right now, caring for someone, doing the right thing with no audience, wondering if it matters, is that it settles into you. The integrity of it. You don't see it working, but it works. It becomes the thing you're made of, and the people worth knowing will eventually be able to tell. Earl could tell. George knew before he died. That's why he asked me quietly, without making it a big thing. He knew I wouldn't say no, and he knew I'd do it right, and he trusted that. Being the person someone trusts that way is not a small thing. It might be the whole thing. I go out to check on the pecans most evenings now, when the light is long. I put my hand on the bark and I don't say anything. I just stay. That feels about right.